We are live, and I am here today with Jose Luis and Kurt from the Soberanía Mexican Politics podcast. And I am going to let them introduce themselves and say hi and talk about what they do and their work. And then we're going to go through an interview of myth busting, which I think is going to be super, super fun. So Kurt, Jose Luis, if you would both introduce yourselves, and then I'll give kind of a rundown of how we got here today, and then we'll get right into the content.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Kate, for having us. This is going to be a great opportunity to have a real in-depth conversation about Mexico and bust some of those myths that are also prevalent about what's going on with the transformation down here. So we're psyched about that. So my name is Kurt Hackbarth, originally from Connecticut, of all places. Been living in Mexico for over 20 years, naturalized citizen, journalist, writer, playwright, have my hand over a bunch of different things, but specifically with regards to journalism, I've been writing about Mexico in Jacobin magazine for the last 7 years. When López Obrador, the previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, came into power. And now we are also on Mexico's public broadcaster, Canal 11, Channel 11, with a show together with Jose Luis and another wonderful colleague, Lina Duarte, called Sin Muros, Without Walls, a show that premiered the day after the Trump 2 inauguration, so January 21st. Obviously, plenty to talk about there. And I'm also on another panel show called Masio Sare. And we have our podcast, Soberanía, which is a key word, I think, for anyone who wants to understand Latin America, the overriding concern with national sovereignty, which is why we chose that word. And that's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So there we are. We're broadcasting from our studio right downtown in Mexico City, literally blocks away from the Zócalo, National Palace, the Supreme Court, and the centers of power. So here we are in the middle of it all.
Here you are.
And my name is José Luis Granado Ceja. I'm a Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I was born here, but I grew up in the United States and Canada. That's why I speak English fluently in New Jersey and in Arizona, and then later on in Toronto. But I've been back in Mexico since 2018 to precisely coincide, likewise, with the fourth transformation of Mexico and do my job as a journalist. I write for Venezuela Analysis. I host their podcast as well, in addition to everything that Kurt just said. And I'm also a freelance journalist covering human rights, democracy, social movements, labor movements throughout the Americas.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for being here. And for those who don't already know, my name is Kate Powell. I am a citizen of the United States who is very angry about what's happening. And this platform is how I productively process what is going on and disseminate information. And I think we can only understand the full picture of what's going on in the United States in the geopolitical context as well, which is why I wanted why I started posting more about Mexico and soon about Canada. But I also wanted to get the voices directly from the country itself, because I think that is one of the issues that we have in the United States, is that a lot of the voices are filtered through American media. And so you get the telephone game of what was said on the ground to the reporter, who said it to the editor, who said it to the English speaker, and it's just, it becomes interesting at that point. How I found Soberania was, I am a big fan of the Pitchfork Economics podcast, and I believe, Jose Luis, you were the one who guested on that.
I was.
Oh, no, it was Kurt. Okay, I'm so sorry. It was so long ago.
We look like twins, so we're easily mistaken.
I didn't watch it. I was trying to remember whose voice I was hearing on it. And it was also a while ago. And I remember listening and just being like, oh my gosh, I'm totally fascinated now. Tell me more. And so I started listening to the podcast, and I have been a faithful listener ever since, and have tried to binge as much of the historical content as I could, and quickly became enamored with just everything that I was hearing as far as what the people of Mexico, not just the figureheads of the government, but what the people have been advancing in Mexico. And I think that's the coolest part about the Cuatro T, the fourth transformation, is that it is so driven by the will of the people. Nothing's perfect. No one said it was, for those of you who want to come and start that nonsense. But we're definitely going to be getting into myth busting about what we're told about Mexico. And I love that you guys are also on Canal Once, your version of our PBS, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
And it's also interesting hearing some of the opinions about that, which is like I'm like public media is some of the best information that we can get. Any nation that's lucky enough to have public media is like that's usually the best source to get information from, or one of the best. And so I just love that we're getting all of this. Okay, so we are here to talk about data and reality with the nuance. We are not here to advance stereotypes or nonsense. So if you're here for that, please spare me your comments. That's going to be those are the rules around here. And let's just start. And either one of you can take turns, go first. It does not matter to me. But I remember when the very first post I put out about Mexico was somewhat of a compliment, but also sort of a jab at our judiciary in the U.S. Because you guys had just completed. It was actually the day of the judicial election, June 1st, and there were many comments on that post, but the number one definitely was Mexico is a narco-controlled country, and I'm quoting this. These are not words that I would go around saying. And there's just no way that any reform could possibly, be valid or work or whatnot in such an environment. So I would just love y'all's take on what is the nature of organized crime and what are the Mexican people trying to do about it.
Want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, it is obviously a very important issue here. It is something that has been a part of daily life for Mexicans, in particular since 2006, when former President Felipe Calderon, in an effort to try to win legitimacy because he was fraudulently elected to office, it's widely believed amongst the Mexican population that the 2006 election was not legitimate. It didn't actually represent the will of the voters, decided to launch a war. And what better in his mind to gather the unity of the Mexican population than to start a war. But of course, it was really ill-conceived, ill-managed, and led to a lot of the situation we're still dealing with now, which is the idea there was to directly confront the organized crime groups here in Mexico with the armed forces of the state. The problem is that it's widely believed that Felipe Calderon was actually operating in favor of one organized crime group in particular. And of course, that turned out to be true when we found out that his security chief, Gerardo Garcia Luna, turned out to be a narco trafficker himself and is actually in jail in the United States right now after being convicted of narco trafficking. So all of that is not really speculation. It's not a biased take. It's the facts on the ground. And of course, that produced a very unstable situation throughout the country that really has only, as of very recently, begun to be turned around. Right. And so we had in the interim, we had Enrique Peña Nieto, who pursued a very similar strategies, likewise using the forces of the state to go after these organized crime groups. But unfortunately, what ended up happening is that it ends up splintering those groups as opposed to actually weakening them and turning them into far more violent groups that, resorted to things like forced disappearances. I think the forced disappearance issue here in Mexico is very much a response to that situation because they figured out that if we don't actually have a lot of bodies, if we're hiding them, then maybe we'll get less attention and, less scrutiny from, authorities. And so really the change in the strategy came in 2018 with López Obrador, who did a number of things. His campaign slogan, which has been oft-cited and misunderstood in the United States, was hugs, not bullets. And basically his emphasis was, we're not in a war anymore. We're not going to use this bellicose language. We're obviously going to attend to the security situation of the country. He created a new body of the armed forces called the National Guard, which is meant to be much closer to the population and actually trained in order to do the kinds of activities that they were being asked, as opposed to the armed forces, which is meant to defend the national territory. And, also attending to the root causes. Right, that's what he means by hugs, not bullets. Not hugs for the armed people, not for the criminal elements, but for the population, to give options to young people so that they're not pursuing a life of crime, attending to the inequality, the marginalization that certainly happens in certain parts of this country that led many young people in particular to join this. And then I think we've also seen a shift with Claudia Sheinbaum having been elected in 2024. Further and further away from this kind of aggressive posturing, but certainly one that is more about targeting operations, using more intelligence, actually trying to attend to the kind of the root causes beyond social causes in the sense of the financing, going after the money that keeps these organizations in place. And interestingly enough, in this effort to collaborate and coordinate with the United States, because this is a major policy issue for them as well, especially with the Trump administration, has actually been to get the U.S. to do more about the river of guns that are flowing into Mexico from the United States.
Because
And so
how many gun shops are there in Mexico again?
there's one.
Right.
And it's in Mexico City, and it's impossible to buy a gun. But yet, the organized crime groups have military-grade weapons. And there was a recent report about how they've been improvising now drones to be able to do this. And all of that comes from abroad. And so the strategy has been to try to get into that. And we're actually seeing results now, which is really the good news in all of this. Mexico has experienced year after year of rising homicides. And actually with Lopez Obrador, they finally leveled off. And now with Claudia Sheinbaum, with the strategy finally paying out, because it's quite difficult to turn that all around, of actually seeing a very significant decline. It is, of course, still an issue, but I think my headline would be, no, of course not. Mexico is not a narco state, right? Mexico is a federal republic with a democracy and elected branches. There is the influence of organized crime groups at the local level, at the state level, but I would categorically reject this notion that is often offered up in mainstream media in the United States, that Claudia Sheinbaum herself or her ministers are somehow tied to organized crime. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, the proof is in the fact that they are tackling the issue head on.
And if you don't believe us, you can listen to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was just down here yesterday, a few blocks from here, saying, "My respect and admiration for the labor of Mexico in confronting narco-terrorist groups." So, Mexico's right wing down here was expecting kind of the United States to back up this whole narco-terrorist discourse and have the rug pulled out from under them. So if you don't believe us, you can listen to Rubio, who's certainly not historically been any friend to Mexican progressive forces.
Yeah, but broken clocks, right?
Right. Yeah. Certainly he's, that's not to give Rubio any credit at all.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting that even he is not going down the rabbit hole of narco gobierno, right? Mm-hmm. That the right wing here is trying to push. Mm-hmm. And it's actually interesting that our podcast was born out of the anger of the U.S. press and very irresponsibly trying to push the narco government narrative in the absolute absence of evidence at the beginning of the presidential campaign last year in 2024. So you saw on the same day, 3 articles come out from ProPublica, Deutsche Welle, and Inside Crime, all of them with obvious leaks from the DEA, trying to push the narrative that there was some connection between drug traffickers and López Obrador's first campaign in 2006, the fraudulent campaign that José Luis mentioned. But there was no evidence about it. They were saying that maybe somebody was in touch with somebody in the staff who maybe got some kind of money, but there was nothing there. There was nothing there. And they even had to, effectively admit and under questioning that, it was a nothing burger. Huh? So then the New York Times comes out the following month in February and tries to play the same game with López Obrador's subsequent campaign in 2018. Well, there was 3, right? He ran in 2006, 2012, and finally in 2018. It was our anger at that kind of irresponsible coverage that led us to start this podcast in the first place. Obviously, part of our job is to cover U.S. media reporting on Mexico. A large part of the problem is that foreign correspondents come here and they live in a bubble. In the wealthy parts of the city, places like Polanco and Lomas, they circulate with the, Mexico elite, absorb that message and parrot it back to U.S. readers. So we were convinced that another English language voice on Mexico was needed. So that's kind of our origin story, right? And just to kind of give a little bit more of the background of what José Luis was saying, I think it's important to talk about the whole drug situation in the context of the neoliberal era Mexico experience for 30 years. Following the devaluation, the massive peso crash of 1982, the IMF comes in and imposes a structural adjustment program. And we know what the IMF requires in exchange for their loans is mass privatizations. So that's what you got. Throughout the 80s and 90s, you saw a mass privatization program of massive chunks of the Mexican state. the airlines, the banks, the mines, the pensions. The health system was pawned off to the state. I mean, just go down the list. Everything was privatized. And so what you got was a hollowing out of the Mexican state at the bidding of national elites, but also of international agencies, which created the ground for cartels to go into the vacuum. They go into the vacuum. And they even start providing substitute services that the government is no longer providing or is providing bad. So when you hollow out the state, when you hollow out the function of the state, when you hollow out the basic concept of the state and community, right? First of all, you're propitiating more migration, which was aggravated by NAFTA. So you combine, the privatization of the state with the free trade agreement, with the mass migration, which tore apart communities. Well, that's a great breeding ground for cartels, isn't it?
100%.
Plus the constant demand from the United States. And let's just, to round that out, recall that the whole idea of a war on drugs was a Nixonian idea. It was begun in the early 1970s, 1971. And Nixon's former advisor, John Ehrlichman, years later, of course, when he was all over, was very clear that the goal of the drug war was to criminalize certain populations within the United States, the anti-war movement and the African-American community. He was very clear on that there was a political element to it. Well, you take that that domestic use of the war on drugs, and you turn that into foreign policy, and you get an excuse to intervene anywhere, which is why they're now conflating the war on drugs, Nixon, with the war on terrorism, Bush Jr. And now you've got like this perverse Reese's peanut butter, chocolate and peanut butter thing together, where it's now narco-terrorism, which can then give them the excuse to do anything anywhere, right? Because now the cartels are FTOs, they're foreign terrorist organizations. Just 2 days ago, the Trump administration blew up a boat of 11 people in the Caribbean. Massive threat to U.S. national security,
Yes,
11 people.
massive threat.
And they claimed that they were part of the Tren de Aragua as the group, which Jose Luis knows much more about, what they are and what they aren't.
Right.
But we'll never know. We'll never know because they just killed them all and blew up the boat.
Right.
So, this is the problem when you start accepting that kind of discourse.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Okay. So much in there. And I just feel like we got a crash course of the last, 30, 40 years of not only, U.S. policy towards Mexico, but also, the inner workings of, like you said, the hollowing out of a government is a breeding ground for something to step into that void. We're seeing the threats of that right here because our government is being hollowed out. The administrative state is being hollowed out post haste. And, especially with HHS, like it is worrisome what will, when you get rid of actual science and actual research and access to vaccines and like things like that, like people are going to figure it out one way or another. And if we think that we're above organized crime in this country, that's a nice world to live in, I guess. But as I had a few people joke with me over various social media channels, we call the cartels PACs in this country. So it's not like this whole idea that we don't have organized, well-funded, well-weaponized, sometimes organizations that are quote unquote pulling the strings in the background is just ludicrous. So yeah, I really appreciate y'all's crash course and kind of like the ins and outs of that. And what seems clear to me is that with AMLO's election in 2018 and then subsequently Scheinbaum's with like approval ratings that no U.S. president could ever in this current state, is clearly the people are taking back their government and their country. It's not perfect. It's nothing is, and it's, like you said, decades in the making. It's not, you can't just like undo that within a couple of years of good policy, but it seems like you guys are certainly heading in the right direction. So that seems to segue perfectly into our next myth that the last two administrations under the fourth transformation, and if you guys wouldn't mind for people who will be listening now and or later, if you wouldn't mind maybe briefly talking about what the fourth transformation is, because since we're in a two-party locked system in the U.S., the whole coalition government thing kind of flies over a lot of heads. They're like, what is that? So would love to know more. But one of the other myths that I have heard a lot about is that the last two Quattro Te administrations are power grabbing through populism, right? They're just sending money to poor people. Again, people, these are quotes; these are not words that I use. And that's how they're getting those approval ratings. It's not because anything on the ground is really that much better. They're basically buying votes. And also, it's probably a good time to talk about the judicial reform because that was done by people's referendum and by, amending your constitution. So however you want to go from there as far as why are the people electing this government? It's because they're being bought, or is there maybe some other reason?
I'll start by explaining what the fourth transformation is. So here in Mexico, there's this concept, it's used throughout the Americas, of rescuing historical memory. And so what it is an effort to kind of tie what's happening today in modern times with historical transformations that have previously happened here in Mexico. And this is the fourth one because the first one was the independence. The second one was the reform period, sort of the liberal period under Benito Juarez and various other reformers at the time. The third one being the Mexican Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, and this one now being the fourth one. And the idea there is very deliberate to say this is part of something so much bigger, these momentous moments where we turn things around. And what are the kind of the principles of it? Well, sovereignty is one. It's about defense of sovereignty and about Mexicans deciding their own future. It's about defending the territory. It's about burying, quite literally using that language, burying the old neoliberal model, building the beginnings of a welfare state. These social programs that we're talking about now are part of that, but also, reinvesting in communities, seeing things like, for example, under López Obrador, the poorest states in Mexico, which are the southern states, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas, being among those now with sort of the greatest increases in gross domestic product, of actual investments, of actually kind of paying that historical debt to all of those who had been forgotten, including the population, seniors who, as a result of these same neoliberal reforms, maybe don't have access to a pension anymore. So what did López Obrador? It's one of his most popular programs that has now continued into the Sheinbaum government, is the universal pension programs. And I always highlight that word universal because it's a very different conception as opposed to, social programs that I always forget the word. What's it called?
Means tested.
Means tested.
Yeah.
Means tested programs, which are focused on very specific communities or very specific circumstances. These are universal. There's even cases of opposition politicians lining up and getting their card and also enjoying the benefit, as is their right, to this universal pension. And it's been an extraordinary success that has, I think, in a lot of ways, yes, obviously transformed people's lives. It's not a huge amount of money. It's around 6,000 pesos every 2 months. But it's the kind of money that changes people's lives, right? Suddenly they have access to medicine or to, higher protein meals, or even things like that are quality of life things, right? You'll hear reports of, people who can say, I can go out to dinner with my family. I couldn't afford to do that anymore. Or take a bus and go visit my grandkids. These are the kinds of things that have really transformed people's lives. And it's not about buying them, right? It's about giving them that sort of basic level of dignity that is their right. I was talking about the transformations that happened before. The Mexican Constitution of 1917, which is in effect right now, is a product of revolution. And it has extraordinarily progressive language in it, which obviously the state had been falling short in actually meeting, and is now actually doing what's necessary to meet the obligations that are demanded of the state in the Constitution to the population. And so, I'd like to push always back against this notion that it's just populism, it's just vote buying, because it's the citizenry themselves will tell you why they're enthusiastic about this government, because it really does represent a qualitative change in their lives in very real material ways. And it's done explicitly using language that's universalist, that's rights-based, as opposed to, for example, the United States, right, where you talk about social programs as entitlement, right? This idea that they're selective and that they can be eliminated at the stroke of a pen. Here in Mexico, there has also been substantial constitutional reforms to strengthen them. And for example, social programs today are a constitutional right, which is to say that even if the political situation in this country changes, they can't come in and easily get rid of those things. And I think that's what eliminates this notion that it's just a populist measure, that it's vote buying, that it's targeted. No, right? It's an opportunity for there to be a direct engagement with the population. We have these, they're basically like social workers, and they're called servidores de la nación. And there's 10,000 of them who basically their job is to make contact with the population on a consistent basis. And my final note on this is that it's actually quite extraordinary in the sense that it can also lead to an expansion of that same nascent welfare state that is starting to be built here. For example, everybody who has signed up for the universal seniors pension was then visited over the summer by these same servidores de la nación, these social workers, to coordinate with them at-home visits by doctors. So now they will have a visit by
Imagine that.
on a consistent
Amazing.
basis.
At-home visits for
Yeah.
senior citizens regularly, not just once.
You know, and expanding hospitals and expanding clinics and all of this to make healthcare a human right, which is in our constitution, which of course, hadn't actually been actualized. And so you can see how now they even have to skip that stage of having to find the population they're meaning to serve because they're actually just expanding what's already begun. And, there's a lot more to come.
And just to add a little bit to that, if you go back in history, previous programs run by the then hegemonic PRI party, which ran Mexico for 71 years, part of the way it maintained its hegemony for so long was what we call programas clientelares, client-based programs that helped their base and was associated with getting out the vote. And it was very much that old system, which is precisely why López Obrador, knowing that history in Mexico, not only Mexico, but it was particularly strong here, decided to make them universal and based on direct transfer to try to cut out intermediaries as much as possible, to not replicate the previous system. And it's interesting that he had to ignore some of these myths. We're talking about myth busting, right? Because there were all these kind of elite commentators saying you have to do means testing because Mexico can't afford universal programs. But means testing requires a very complicated bureaucracy to set up, which then, and then it gums the whole thing up and it takes a lot longer for the rollout. And it creates a lot of glitches along the way, which can then be used to attack the programs. It's like when Obamacare was rolling out and they couldn't get the website going and it was just a disaster and it was going on and on and on for weeks. And it was just used as a way to attack the program. So López Obrador said, Occam's razor, let's make this as simple as possible, make it universal, give everybody a debit card, deposit money in a debit card, and let's just do it that way. That was López Obrador's big focus, was on transfer programs. Scheinbaum's focus is keeping those programs and building on top of them, right? For like the home outreach program and a series of other programs that, have, boots on the ground and that kind of rollout. But that's important to mention. The other main myth that López Obrador faced, and this is important, is raising the minimum wage is going to cause inflation.
Oh, yes.
And he had to look that one right in the face and stare it down and say, no, we're going to raise the minimum wage. So they raised the minimum wage about 15 to 20% every year. It was very low. It was starting from a very low bar, and it's still too low. But it's 135% higher than it was at the beginning of 2018. And what is inflation right now in Mexico? 3.5%.
Right.
So you have to stare these myths down and just say they're wrong and not, be paralyzed by them. And that's a very important.
On that point, I wanted to just add this, which is we just got a report from the state information agency, INEGI, it's called. Mm-hmm. And they do a survey every 2 years around poverty. And this report revealed that nearly 13.5 million people were lifted out of poverty from 2018 to 2024, basically the term for López Obrador. There'll be updated figures to account for what the changes with Sheinbaum, of course, as well. And interestingly enough, breaking down that data, we come across the notion that it's actually not social programs. They play an important role, of course, in actually lifting. Right. But it's been the increase in the
rising wages,
the more favorable legislation for labor unions, all of these kinds of things that actually it's about, tilting things in favor of the working class, eliminating outsourcing, for example. That's actually been the most substantial impact when it comes to lifting people out of poverty. And yes, even of all people, the former right-wing president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, who was president from 2000-2006 from the right-wing National Action Party, the PAN, confessed. He's like, this is the only thing I'll give López Obrador credit for. Raising the minimum wage was clearly the right strategy. He even told a whole anecdote about how he used to have lunches every month with the business leaders of Mexico. And they would all say, don't raise the minimum wage. And he would listen to them. And he's like, I was wrong to listen to them. This is clearly good policy, which is, I think, particularly important in the case of the United States, which hasn't seen a federal minimum wage increase in decades. I think it's still at $7.25, 2009.
Yeah,
725, right?
it is
And just a couple of figures that from the State of the Union address to speak to this point that that Scheinbaum read on Monday. Um, Foreign direct investment reached a record high in the first half of the year in Mexico, getting up to $36 billion. If Mexico is a narco state, why is foreign direct investment at an all-time high?
Yes.
That seems
And
to be
ours
kind of
is
a
down. Ours is
right.
down. So it's great.
The number of international visitors to Mexico grew by 13.8% compared to the same period of the previous year. If Mexico is a narco state, and if large swaths of the country are in control of the cartels, like they're proclaiming on Fox News, why is tourism up? Are they all just going to tiny enclaves? I guess you can try to make that case, but if you travel the country, you know that this is actually not the case. Are there problems? Of course there are. Are large swaths of the country in the control of the cartels? No, they're not. The currency is stable at below 19 pesos per dollar. Unemployment's at 2.7%. Inflation is at 3.5%. And I think this is really important. Federal government revenues as of August 31st topped 5.95 trillion pesos, which is like 320 billion in the US terms, 8.5% higher in real terms than 2024. Mexico is increasing its tax receipts, which is important because it's traditionally been amongst the lower countries in the OCDE for tax receipts. It depended for far too long on oil revenue. So the fact that tax receipts are going up is important. And then finally, public debt at the end of August is at 50% of GDP. What is it in the US now?
If only 125.
125, and apparently with a big beautiful bill might go up to
It's going to
135.
go up 4.5 trillion. We raised the debt ceiling by 5 trillion. 4.5 trillion is the current estimate from the big beautiful bill. So that was my big beat over the summer, was that big ugly thing. I heard so many things in here, and I wanted to just like put little spotlights on them. One is that this is all just really enacting the constitutional principles that you guys already had. When people are talking about like, oh, this is just some like crazy revolutionary populism, it's actually like, no, these are supposed to be our values, and we're actually just going to do them now, as opposed to making them political shuttlecocks to use in elections. Which brings me to my second point of that whole idea of universalism versus an entitlement program that's means tested. That is why, we have the back and forth that we have in the United States. It's because both parties are guilty of this, of, playing to their base and deciding like we're going to do programs, and rather than just make them universal to get rid of all of those problems and controversies that you guys so beautifully outlined, we're going to use them as election talking points. And it's like, if we could just stop doing that and enshrine them in law and stop turning them into political bludgeons, you actually take the venom out of the whole thing, and it actually becomes, I think, easier probably to hold on to power. Or at least that seems to be the case study between AMLO and Scheinbaum. Is you guys have 6-year terms for your presidents, and they can't run for re-election, correct? They're limited to one, and so. It would be very easy to do the back and forth, because, like, at least ours, they're 4-year terms, obviously, but they're allowed to run for reelection. And it seems pretty clear that if you have such a, like a steady, smooth transition, because, the policy was make it good for the country, not the people who voted for me, that really advances the agenda and the rights that you guys have enshrined in your constitution so wisely. Do I have that right? Is there anything that I've misspoken there?
No, you're totally correct. The only thing I would add is that, interestingly enough, Mexico was one of the very, very few countries that bucked the so-called anti-incumbency trend, right? So many governments were kicked out of office following the pandemic, and instead, actually, the mandate was strengthened. Claudia Sheinbaum in 2024 runs on the Morena ticket, wins by a landslide, and actually exceeds López Obrador's support. She got almost 60%, whereas López Obrador got around 53%, millions of more votes, and crucially, wins a supermajority in the Congress. So all these people who talk about, populist power grabs fail to understand that everything has been actually a product of Mexico's democratic system, that of people actually responding, using their vote to what they perceive to be in their interest, of actually saying this government has actually represented a change, and therefore I'm going to vote for the party's candidate once again. And I think it's important to say this because, there was a lot of ideas that were prevented from being fully completed by López Obrador in his term, precisely because they didn't have a supermajority in the Congress. They had to negotiate with the opposition. And the opposition, at a certain point, made the decision that they were going to obstruct everything and to try to make it...
Sound familiar? Obstruct
No,
everything?
it doesn't. I have no
Yeah.
idea. I've never seen that
No
before.
relation.
One of the more controversial ones, the one that got so many people talking here on your channel, was the judicial reform to directly elect the judges up to and including the Supreme Court, which we have carried out the vote and they took office this past Monday. But that didn't go through. So there was an explicit call to say, deliver us a supermajority, and we're going to be able to deepen this process and engage in these constitutional reforms that are pending. And the population, I've always argued, did so deliberately, consciously, saying, we are going to deliver a supermajority. And actually, Mexico's system is sort of designed to prevent it from happening. They have these kind of Byzantine rules around the Senate in particular, the upper house, that the second place person wins their seat anyway. But even then, even given kind of the cards being stacked against Morena, secured just shy of a supermajority in the upper house and won a very clear one in a 2/3 majority in the lower house, and eventually secured it through negotiations in the upper house. That's why we've seen reform after reform after reform. I always kind of use that hip hop term, can't stop, won't stop, of just kind of going without pausing, right? Like all gas, no brakes around delivering people. Like, you gave us a supermajority, right? We're going to use it, and we're going to use it to advance our agenda, which we always talked about. For example, Obama, when he had the filibuster-proof Senate, did nothing with it and then lost it in the next election, right? You have to actually act. You have to show the population, hey, we are actually delivering on our mandate.
We've actually had to explain in Mexico, because sometimes we're kind of political translators one way or another, what the term rotating villain is. Mexicans are really interested in the idea of what's this idea of the rotating villain? Oh, it's the U.S. Senate, where they always pick the one person to screw it all up, right? And they just rotate it, right?
Yes. Our current ones are Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. There are rotating villains. They take turns either hand wringing or screwing us over. So that's super fun. So I would love to learn more. Speaking of supermajorities and a real mandate from the people, when you win by those numbers, that is a real mandate. I'm not speaking to anybody in particular, but we seem to be confused about that on this side of the border. And so the judicial reform, there was a lot of running of garments about that. And like you said, it wasn't like it was snuck upon the people all of a sudden when a supermajority came in. It was a very much announced in broad daylight type thing of, hey, if you give me this will happen. And the people apparently were like, cool, let's do it. And then I believe even the day before, I know for the election turnout, which you can definitely talk about the difference between like election turnouts and approval. But I know there was polling the day before the election itself, I believe, showing that the people were still very much behind it. The turnout for the actual election was 13%, which I know the right was using to like bludgeon the whole thing. And even international watchdog group type stuff were saying, well, the low turnout shows that it was just like it wasn't a valid election. And to which I'm just like, I don't know. There's so many elections that have similar turnout numbers. But, if you want to speak to more to that, because when I say that I got blasted on social for saying that it was like legitimizing the judicial reform at all, it was crazy. And I will say that there were clearly plenty of people on both sides of the issue. It wasn't like, an all or nothing thing. But I was very surprised, and especially from Americans, speaking from the American side, I was very surprised at the reaction. One, because we do elect judges over here, so I don't know why people were acting like it was
in a majority of states.
Right, yeah, in a majority of states we do that in the Supreme Courts of those United States. It's not, it's not just like, so it was very interesting when people were screaming to the skies about it. I was like, you do know that happens. But also, one of the biggest things I heard was corruption. They're going to be corrupt because they're subject to the whims of the people, and acting like judges aren't political. Judges are apolitical, which it's a thought, it's a take. And also looking at our own Supreme Court, the bastion of morality and anti-corruption, for sure. Like, there's just no evidence whatsoever in U.S.'s SCOTUS about any kind of, there's a lot of sarcasm for those who are not picking up on that. So I would just love to know more about what was going on with the judiciary before. Why were the people like, yes, Morena, we'll give you a supermajority to fix this? Because clearly there was a problem.
The short answer to that is that the Mexican judiciary has been a bastion of corruption for years, just years. And it got to this intolerable point where people were fed up with it. We're talking about, a judiciary where half of the employees in the judiciary were based on nepotism, right? Families, the family and friends ticket there, where you had judges basically acting as personal lawyers for Mexico's elite strata, right? You were talking before about how they say the social programs are giveaways. The real giveaways in Mexico were tax write-offs given by presidents and then, rubber stamped by judges for years, for years. One of Mexico's richest individuals right now, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, who is the owner of one of Mexico's two main television stations, TV Azteca, has a back tax bill of $3 billion. $3 billion back tax bill that he's just had judges in his pockets, allowing that to go on for years. People were sick of their ostentatious lifestyle. We're talking about salaries and benefits in the realm of $30,000 a month, with drivers, with private health insurance, with every single little perk and benefit, massive meal budgets on top of all that. They lived the life of Riley in the face of a population where the minimum wage, was at that time about $5 a day.
Right.
They were lording it over people in this medieval feudal style while they were writing off taxes for their friends, while they were freeing people. So, governments would try to jail, attorney generals would try to jail people, and they'd just be a revolving door. There was just the term sabadazo, which is sábado is Saturday. They would free people really frequently on Saturday, knowing the government couldn't really do anything about it until Monday. So out they go, sabadazo. Or they'd get what's called as amparos, which is a kind of an injunction to be able to block any kind of action being taken against them. So it created an absolute sense of impunity for this caste of people at the top. People were sick of it. I mean, they were sick of having to, and I've seen cases, literally bribe judges to do their job.
Yeah.
And so instead of falling into this fatalism that we can't touch the judicial branch, so peddled by international NGOs. Right. Yeah. Why can't you touch the judicial branch? Why not? Why can't you reform the judicial branch? The judicial branch supposedly had a discipline mechanism for corrupt judges, but who was running that? The Chief Justice of the Mexican Supreme Court, and surprisingly, they never did anything for. So AMLO tried to make a series of changes, which were batted back. That was plan A. Then he tried to pass a law, which was surprisingly found, struck down by the court, plan B. So he finally said, listen, look, I'm going to go to the people. We're going to do this. We're going to do 20 constitutional reforms. Give me a supermajority. And he said that in February. The election was in June. And he got the supermajority. So I don't know how people can argue that it's not democratic. He said exactly what he was going to do. And they got a 60% of the vote. And then, with the way the seats are allotted with proportional position, it got to 2/3 majority.
Right. Yeah.
That's what happens.
Right.
Sorry.
You
sorry.
Mean it wasn't cooked up by some black magic ritual in a back room and then sprung on all y'all on June 1st of this year. You just had to run to the polls and figure it out. It didn't have, because I thought it did. I was very much under the impression from some of the feedback I was getting that, y'all were just woken up at dawn on June 1st.
We're shaking out of our beds. We're shaking out of our beds. And, why should we have to put up with, one understands the need for judicial independence, of course. But does that mean that Clarence Thomas can lord his corruption over all of us forever? Because apparently that's what the U.S. system does.
Yes, that is.
Take VIP trips around the world from people who have interest before the Supreme Court in your face. Right. Or Samuel Alito. And we just have to say, well, that's just the way it is.
Right. That's just the way it is. Quick plug for later this month. I am going to be interviewing, for those who are watching, Leah Littman, who has just authored the book Lawless. Amazing expose, basically, of the U.S. Supreme Court, and highly recommend. But I'll be interviewing her at the end of September to talk specifically about the judicial class, it's kind of the caste system that has been It's because it's not just a Mexican dynamic. It is 100% in the U.S. as well. Lawyers tend to be affluent, and they're the ones who become judges, and then they're protecting their lawyer. It's kind of a good old right, exactly, and it's very much a revolving door, and it's very nepotism based. And so anyway, I could
And on that point, actually,
rail forever about the that's for sure.
on that point specifically, one of the things that really kind of justifies this whole experience around electing judges is that the rule set out that the person who received the most votes for the Supreme Court seats would become the president for the first year. And that person is Ulay Aguilar Ortiz. He is a Mixteco indigenous activist from Oaxaca who is from the grassroots. And he himself said in the inauguration, somebody like him would have never made it to that office had it not been for this democratic reform. And it's actually not that outlandish, I think, in particular for people in the United States where you do elect judges. But I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination in any sense to think while the executive branch is elected, the legislative branch is elected, why shouldn't the judicial as well?
Right.
And it gives us a chance to throw the bums out if they don't do a good job. Right. To say, we're going to vote you out because you were a bad judge.
Exactly.
And one of the key things I think too was there's a body, Consejo de la Judicatura,
Right.
which is in charge of disciplining judges. And because it was like this in-group and they were all friends and all of this, it never punished judges ever, even when there were really obvious cases of inappropriate conduct, be it personally or in the carrying out of their duties. So this one was also elected. And so now there's a directly elected body that's going to handle this. And if they don't do a good job, we'll throw them out too, right? Like, I think, the voter turnout was 13 point something percent, right? I actually expected it was going to be between 10 and 15% approximately because it was a complicated vote. There was a sheet after sheet after sheet. And there wasn't, I would actually say, I think the electoral authority, it's called the INE, didn't do a good enough job of actually getting the vote out. They actually made it so that the government ministers and the president and all the rest of the elected officials weren't able to not campaign, but promote the vote. So that actually, I think, affected things. There was a lot of things that went wrong, but it was also the first experience with it. Right. I think it'll be interesting to see next time around, what's the turnout like? What's it like? The actual experience of going to vote. It was totally new to me, and I'm somebody who's pretty politically attuned, right? So it's not too particularly surprising. And also, we don't have any rules in terms of like there being a minimum threshold. There is for referendum, but not for elections. So ultimately, the persons who were elected based on the people who turned out to vote. If the opposition had gotten their stuff together, then they would have been able to elect some of their people into the Supreme Court.
Right.
Instead of complaining in your comments, they could have actually gone out to vote.
Oh my goodness.
Instead,
it really was like, why are you here? Aren't you supposed to be voting right now?
Go out and vote.
We probably have the single most progressive Supreme Court on the planet as a result of the population voting for them.
I did. I remember when the comments first started coming in and trying, I at first I was trying to be sensitive to the fact that I'm, American. I'm a United States citizen. I am not Mexican. I am not Hispanic. I don't have, I have no familial ties to Mexico. So I didn't want to be like, quote unquote, colonial and start like, raining it down on people. But I stayed like back a little bit. I remember when I was first getting like roasted, and then as I was watching the results come in, particularly the Chief Justice results come in, I was like, I'm waiting. I started getting catty with people. I was like, I'm waiting for the part where the bought and paid for Morena folks are going to be ruling this entire court, because that's what you guys told me is happening right this minute, and I'm still waiting. Like it doesn't appear to be happening. Like there was so much like this is going to be so bad for the indigenous folks. There was like a rain of fury, and it just like as the results started coming in, I was like, what? What are we talking about right now? And it got quiet relatively quickly, I will say, within a couple of days. I have the odd comment here and there, but it was very interesting how chilled that narrative got relatively fast as the actual results came in.
It's going to be very interesting this first few months, the first year of the new court, because there's been a lot of right-wing opposition to López Obrador, the Cuatro T, but to a point, because really their interests haven't been, that affected. There haven't been tax increases. There haven't been a tax increase for the wealthy. They've done it all without it raising taxes. The
judiciary was standing in the way, right?
The judiciary was standing in the way of that and other things. The programs are universal. But now there's going to be some high-profile tax cases that are going to affect some very rich people in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Like
I'm
Pliego, like Movie Star, like a lot of these big multinationals that have been used to getting away with murder here, and sometimes literally with murder. Right? So, like, for example, when Lopez Obrador tried to reform the country's electrical grid, which was in the control of, Spanish companies like Iberdrola and whatever, which was using a grid constructed by the public, for the public good, but it was being used for private interests because that's the way it had been set up. Basically, they were cannibalizing the grid. What Lopez Obrador said is 55% of the grid has to be, public sourced energy, and then private companies can have their place. But we want to guarantee, a public sourced energy that's, available and reliable. Then U.S. Ambassador Ken Salazar, who was a fossil fuel lobbyist, we know exactly who Ken Salazar is, tried to play the game of being a green energy advocate. Ken Salazar, who supports fracking. That Ken Salazar was down here trying to play the role of Mr. Green Energy because they were trying to use this kind of greenwashing argument that public energy is dirty, private energy with all these, shiny brochures is green.
Right.
So they tried to pass that within hours. That was hit by lawsuits. Within hours, and it was just stopped in its tracks. It was stopped in its tracks by an organized, concerted campaign of lawfare at the behest of energy multinationals.
Right.
And if you see throughout the history of Latin America, how many recent progressive leaders have been deposed by lawfare or constitutional coups?
Yep.
We're talking about Lula was jailed. Dilma Rousseff was ousted. Pedro Castillo from Peru is in jail at the moment, right? Jorge Glass, the former vice president of Ecuador, is, basically a prisoner of the Noboa regime, and you could go on and on. So, people in Mexico see this, and you see how the right wing weaponizes the courts. It's obvious. So we can't be naive about how power works and just let the judiciary branch do whatever, because they will coup you if they can get away with it.
Yeah.
They will do it without a second thought if they think they can get away with it.
Yeah.
So, there's a difference between taking office and taking power. And I think that's sometimes where the procedural people, and you have to, procedures. Yes,
the institutionalists are very They're very, and I'm not anti-institutionalist. Far from it. Because I think sometimes I think sometimes people do kind of rail in like an anarchical sort of way, and I'm like, that's not really helpful either. But there's a difference between throwing it all out and having a plan and making a process, and like you said, there were procedural issues with the election. It was difficult to navigate all those ballots. It was also the first one. The first time we do anything is usually pretty crappy. And I'm speaking as a public administrative person, public and private administrative person. It's, you can't, if you're basing it on was the first process of it ever perfect? Okay, well, nothing would ever get done. But yeah, no, I think the sacred cow of quote unquote apolitical judges, which I'm like, I've never met an apolitical judge. I don't know what that means. I believe it's a figment of all of our imaginations. Every judge is going to have their bias. We talk about who nominated, like it's a Trump appointed or an Obama appointed or whatever judge for a reason, because we know that they're political animals. And it does strike me that people are trying to hide behind that's just the way it is thing, when it's like, no, it doesn't have to be. And I appreciate that. So again, the reason that I admire it here from the US is that it's clearly the Mexican people being like, you work for us, actually, in case y'all forgot somewhere along the way. I love to refer to Congress over here as our employees when I'm calling them, and I'm like, I'm talking to my staff right now. And I know that sounds like, again, it's kind of like my catty, snarky way of getting through the world, but it's also true. Okay, we could go on I love the law and I love the judiciary, but I do want to get to this next myth because I think it's extremely important for the U.S. Because I think we actually need to see that our government is not infallible. I think that's actually more hope inducing than this idea that our government is able to just like railroad everybody else. And that is the idea that Mexico without the US, it's just nothing. You're totally at the mercy of the US government and certainly President Trump, and he's got all the cards, and Scheinbaum has none, which I think is really interesting because I just read a report from somewhere that showed that Mexico does the highest level of importing to the United States, $500 billion in 2024, it looks like, and therefore seems to be doing better on the whole tariff situation than most of the other countries in similar to yep exactly half a trillion in 2024. So I just want to know what what is like the reality as far as the relationship between the US and Mexico. Obviously it changes almost every day. Marco Rubio was just there this week. But what, like, I guess this whole idea that of US exceptionalism, which I take huge issue with, and whatnot. How do Mexicans, first of all, feel about that, and then how are they responding to that dynamic? And certainly how is the administration responding?
I think if really it was the case, this myth that the United States can basically do whatever it wants, then they probably would have bombed Mexico already. And I say that because there are people inside the Trump government who want to bomb Mexico. They think that's the solution to the drug trafficking problem. Obviously, they haven't, and they haven't because I think in a large part because of who's in power right now, because of Claudia Sheinbaum. She has been a brilliant negotiator. Even a lot of voices inside the United States have somewhat reluctantly, I would say, admitted that she's kind of a Trump whisperer, or an anti-Trump. There was this interesting piece in the Times from Goldberg saying basically that. How is it that she's done it? And I think a lot of it is just her really shrewd negotiating and keeping the United States off of our back. Mexico is the number one trading partner of the United States. It stopped being China, 3 years ago? Mm-hmm. As a result of other policies that actually marginalized China in their trade relationship with the United States. And Mexico being so close and also having a manufacturing base kind of stepped up and filled that gap. And so this notion that, the United States doesn't need Mexico is pretty absurd. And it actually has been that leverage that Sheinbaum has used to talk her way out of these tariffs. Mexico is now one of the very least tariff countries on the country and on the planet. And that's because of successful negotiating. In terms of how Mexicans feel, we have a very kind of anti-imperialist instinct here. We are very distrustful. The United States has invaded Mexico on several occasions. It stole half of our territory. It occupied the port of Veracruz in the Mexican Revolution, right? It sent troops into Mexico to try to arrest Pancho Villa. So there's a lot of mistrust, but there's also a lot of love, right? Like we've had a very long-standing relationship. There's all kinds of, cross-border activity. People who live on the border are binational in a lot of ways, right? Obviously, it's a lot easier for, U.S. people to come to Mexico than it is the other way because we have to get visas and stuff like that. But there is a closeness there that has endured despite the various different kinds of manifestations of aggressive U.S. foreign policy, especially towards Mexico, but also the region more broadly, right? Mexico has always kind of been almost as a buffer between the United States and the rest of Latin America. Mm-hmm. And so I think, there's always goodwill. And I think it's also really important, given, for example, Marco Rubio's visit just this week, of showing that, that there can be cooperation with respect for sovereignty. I think that, for me, is the takeaway. Rubio is a very controversial figure, to say the least. He has made very, very troublesome statements with regard to Mexico, but a lot of countries in Latin America. He's very much interested in overthrowing governments. He has a very anti-left disposition. But even then, he tend to come here and admit that the cooperation is working and that no one works as closely with the United States on key issues than Mexico, which actually also served really well to kind of silence the opposition that we were talking about earlier here, that has been trying to push forward this narrative that it's a narco government and that the United States, some of them literally had the expectation that Rubio was going to come here and scold Sheinbaum and announce that all of these politicians are narco politicians, and then he was going to take them back on his plane to the United States to be, extradited. Outlandish. And instead, he had but good things to say. I don't care what Rubio thinks about us up until the point of where it might affect us, but I do think it speaks to the shrewdness, to the perspicacity of this government that has been very, very successful, because the Trump administration could have really, basically exploded the entire project here. And thus far, they have managed to navigate that while also, and this is always my takeaway, we have to endure sometimes, U.S. efforts to interfere, pushing back against this notion that it's an acceptable foreign policy to, bomb inside of foreign territory, as some are proposing. But ultimately, all of this is about the domestic agenda, right? How far are we able to do things in terms of reducing poverty, improving people's lives, expanding social programs, building infrastructure, all of these different projects that the government has set out to do and is still doing successfully, increasing government revenue, all the rest of it, right? We may have to swallow a bitter pill from time to time when it comes to the United States, but ultimately the project is advancing forward.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, as soon as Trump was elected, within days he was trumpeting tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Those are actually the first two countries he mentioned, right? So he said first day in office. Well, first day in office, Karen went, didn't do it, and then by the beginning of February, he said we're doing it, right? Uh, Scheinbaum got on the phone, they put it off, right? Then they were going to do it. I think was it 60 days later from there. Again,
April
got on
1,
the phone.
Liberation Day.
Then they got the Liberation Day. Trump's big stupid, table with the island with the penguins off of Australia and all that shit. And Mexico wasn't on there. And again, the Mexican right wing's like, oh, Mexico's going to get so shafted. It didn't happen again.
Right.
So Scheinbaum has managed to at least get the tariff thing kicked down the road at least, 3 times now. And now it's in another limbo. There was another 90-day pause on that. She's a very shrewd negotiator, as José Luis said, has actually managed to charm Trump on a very personal level, but also has a massive popular mobilization behind it. And this is important because I think in kind of the individualistic U.S. lens, we tend to individualize politics. It's just Trump and Scheinbaum, and that's it. But actually, on the Mexican side, there's a big public, support bolstering the president from behind. So when the first tariff threat came up, Scheinbaum called for a public mobilization here in the Zocalo, a few blocks away, right? And actually, they came to a tentative agreement a few days ahead of time. So people thought, oh, well, that's going to kind of take the air out of the mobilization. Well, 350,000 people showed up.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, Cleveland, the size of Cleveland in the Zocalo and the surrounding blocks. Right?
The Zocalo is one of the biggest public squares in the world,
Mhm.
and it was too small to hold the crowd.
Amazing. Love
Yeah, when you have a rally like that in the center of Mexico City, it's this idea of mass politics that has gotten lost along the way in the United States. It used to exist.
Right.
There used to be mass politics, right?
Right.
And we saw a little bit of that with Bernie and other things, but I mean, sustained mass politics, which means that the whole downtown is closed down. It becomes pedestrianized streets. You've got bands playing on the corners. You've got people with stilts. You've got jugglers. You've got poets. You've got people from all different kinds of the country contingents
Don't
coming in
forget the street
everywhere. The street food, it's just, they're festivals.
Right. Yeah.
We've lost the idea in the global north that politics can be entertaining, can be fun. Mass
Right.
mobilization can be fun, right? And so there was that support behind her in the negotiations. Without that, however able of a negotiator she is, it wouldn't have gotten as far as she did. Now, yesterday they came to an agreement to, try to handle the border and try to neutralize this whole fentanyl discourse and the border discourse to the
Right.
extent that that's possible, right? With massive U.S. pressure, right? We've seen now both Rolling Stone and Ken Klippenstein have reported that there are very serious plans within the Trump administration of people who want to bomb Mexico. Maybe not do a ground invasion. I have a whole article in Jacobin on how catastrophic that would be, but targeted drone strikes like they've done in the Middle East, right?
I was going to say,
and that's worked out really well.
Right.
So, just like that boat in international waters, but actually within national territories, that would be an utter disaster. That would be an absolute and utter disaster. But there are people who are trying to go that way.
Right.
So, which is why the importance of the mobilization is important, and the importance of the agreement they came to yesterday, which appears to neutralize some of the worst of it, because the Trump administration has been all over Scheinbaum. Poor Scheinbaum too. She's tried to roll out. Mexico wants to create a whole R&D tech innovation sector, which didn't really exist before, putting a satellite into space, doing an electric car, doing semiconductors, doing a whole raft of really interesting projects, but she's had to deal with effing Trump every damn day.
Right.
And if it's not the screw worm and closing the border, it's,
Right.
they're trying to renege on the water treaty, or Ted Cruz is saying you have to accept troops, or every single day there's been just one way to kind of turn the screw.
Right.
Every day.
Yes.
Right.
The Mexican phrase, chinga que dicho.
Chinga que dicho.
Your Mexican viewers will know that term.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And it's so interesting because as you're talking, I'm imagining like all the other things that are going on as far as like global geopolitical relationships. The summit that President Xi just had in China with India and Russia and North Korea. And to me, I'm almost like, quite frankly, if Trump has any neurons firing in that head of his, Mexico could be your best friend, and is frankly probably the only one still willing to play ball with you, because everybody else is starting to get tired of it.
Yeah.
And that's really
Mexico is too, but they're still willing to play ball simply because of geographic realities, right?
Right, because of the reality, because of the fact that there is some enemy of my enemy going on too, and whatnot. Like, nobody's trying to run into the arms of North Korea, for instance, except China, maybe. And so it's just, it's just dumb to be poking at her and y'all as much as is happening, because I've heard a few good minds on this say, like, we're gonna find out soon how replaceable we are if we don't stop the nonsense. Because I mentioned American exceptionalism earlier, and I really mean US exceptionalism. This idea that we can just, walk into a room and be like, this is what it's gonna be, mic drop, peace out, and everyone's just gonna swallow that. Like that word, that maybe that's been the optics for a long time. And to me, what it looks like our government is doing is thinking those optics were the whole story, when it was like there was always more going on behind the scenes as far as like concessions and cooperation, like the adults at the political table would have actual conversations, and then of course the PR of it and how it's actually presented to the public is what can be something quite different. But to me, this administration, I mean the U.S. administration, is behaving as if that exceptionalism, which was always kind of a fairy tale and only like the surface level of the story, is like the whole story. Like, and I just am like, for my sake, selfishly, please stop doing that. Because we live in a global like reality now. Like, it's the year 2025. We don't have the option to go isolationist really without ruining everything. So I have to hand it to her to, like, quite frankly, I'm like, please don't stop loving us before this term is over. Like, just and I think it's really cool to hear, to also talk about the reality that you guys are mentioning of the people themselves. First of all, are rallied around the thing, but they're also, and I saw hints of this, especially when LA was being invaded, is still being invaded. Is that the people seem to be clear in Mexico that, like, the vast majority of the US, as far as like citizens like myself and others, like, we are not for this. Like, we're kind of like blinking twice, we need your help, get us out of here. And I just, like, it warms my heart to know that it's not like, oh, all of them are just useless and anti-Mexico, because we're not. And I have many followers with some of the other content that I've posted on Mexican politics and what's going on geopolitically that are like, wow, Mexico's really, like, why not us? And I look to the day past this term, perhaps, hopefully, where we can get back to having an outwardly cooperative administration, and taking some notes. An 80 to 85% approval rating, is hovering between 75 to 85% on any given day. Like, I think Reagan was the last person to get that. Maybe Clinton. I don't know. I don't even know if Clinton got that high.
I
So
think Clinton wasn't there.
yeah,
Yeah. Even Bush
you know,
after 9/11 and
Yeah.
yeah, like it's never been that high. And I just and I remember the first time I heard you guys say like she's sitting at an 85% approval rating, and I was like, 85. Like, what does that mean? And so yeah, I love to hear all of this. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking because this is y'all's interview. I would love to hear more from you guys about anything else that you want to express about Mexico, your country, what you love, what you want to see, and maybe some hopeful notes for the future to wrap up on those, because there's plenty of doomerism, and one thing I really try to do on my channels is give people kind of that North Star of like, yes, it's shit right now, like, to be honest, but nothing is forever. It doesn't have to be forever. The reforms you guys were just talking about shows that doesn't have to be forever. So what what would you like to express that hasn't already been covered thus far?
I wanted to pick up on what you were saying because I saw this video from Richard Wolff where he was talking about why people only hear the bad things about Mexico, and I think he was absolutely right. Which is that it tends to happen because if they knew the good things about Mexico, they might take inspiration from it. And we are so similar in so many ways. Like our political system is actually pretty similar. We're both federal republics, bicameral legislature, a very strong executive. A legacy of a two-party system that obviously here in Mexico we've been able to finally dismantle. That you obviously could as well. But of understanding that this has been the culmination in a lot of ways of a very long decades-long process. I would say that a lot of what is happening today actually can trace its roots back into 1968. Which was, a global uprising, young people demanding more democracy, less inequality, and the rest of it. Mexico was no exception. Except I would say that what happened here in Mexico was a military defeat, and that's no insignificant thing. They quite literally were either killed or jailed or, exiled. It was a brutal crushing of the democracy movement in this country, and it's had to pick up the pieces several times. We had in 1988 a fraud where Salinas was elected, and it was quite likely that it was not legitimate, and it was the product of electoral fraud. And then kind of picking up the pieces and creating a new political party called the PRD that was kind of the left flank of the PRI, obviously other democratic forces coming in, and then the 2006 fraud and the 2012 fraud, which was slightly different in the sense that it was basically an election that was bought with illegal money. And then, because of that experience, another left of center party had to be founded, right? Like it had to happen twice in order to actually get to this point. But every time kind of picking ourselves back up, understanding that, this is still the path. This is how we're going to get there. We're going to get there one way or another. And, we're seeing the fruits of that. And I think before we started, we were talking about, there's a great sense of optimism here. It feels great to live in Mexico. I've lived in some of the greatest cities of North America, like Toronto, like not quite in New York City, but just outside, right? I've been to Chicago, Los Angeles. These are wonderful places, right? But nothing feels like Mexico City, for example, where you really, the phrase I always use is that as a working class person, I can not only survive, but thrive. And it's because of the redistribution of wealth through the state. Right? We have nice parks. We have affordable transit. It gets everywhere, right? There's a Calle 13, Residente Calle 13 is doing a free concert this Saturday in the Zócalo, right? I bought tickets for my son for that concert, and I think they were like $100. And now if I want to go see them, I can go see them for free, right? Like these kinds of things that just make life so livable and is made through the process of political action, of actually leveraging the state to make lives better for everybody, not just for a privileged few. And it's amazing to live here. I went to a talk with David Harvey, and the first thing he says when he goes to the mic was like, it's really good to be in Mexico because the rest of the world has gone to shit. That is true.
Yeah.
Mexico's got to kind of hold the line for a while, but we're hoping other people can come in because it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to hold that line. Just
need you all to like get on this, please.
Yeah.
Well, and like there's 40 million Mexicans in the United States, right? I think there actually is a perfect way for us to really see ourselves as equals, as understanding that what's happening here could happen there, and actually think that some of the way that it can sneak its way in is precisely from the Mexican American community living in the United States. I can speak to what's happening here, but those voices aren't the ones who are jumping into your comments, right? I was going to say this earlier. Unfortunately, there's also kind of the reproduction of neoliberal thought, where because of decades of neoliberalism here, who are the people who had access to higher education and ended up going to universities in the United States and Canada and Western Europe and the rest of it, who speak English in a fluent way? Well, it's, a certain cast of people who have very specific class biases as well, right? They want to protect their middle class privilege, and they don't understand that this is a process for the masses. This is, as Kurt was talking about, mass politics for mass appeal, for mass benefit, right? For the working classes, for the peasantry. We have to remember, Mexico is still, it's a very rich country with a lot of poor people, right? More than half the population is still living in undignified conditions, and all of that should be changed because we have the wealth to do it. And that's the population that this government is serving. It's not the people who go on to work for the Mexico Institute or the Baker Institute and all of these think tanks and things like that. The people who, pat themselves on the back because they got another article published calling Mexico an authoritarian state. Meanwhile, everybody here is finally grateful that democracy is delivering results for them.
And I think just to add to that too, I wrote a piece on Mexico's lessons for the international, left, right? Not everything is transferable, right? Every country has its own history, its own context. Mexico has a very kind of inward-looking way of handling its own history and its movements. So not all of it is immediately transferable. Some of it is. We talked about some of the, staring down the myths about minimum wage causing inflation, about means testing and going universal. Some of these things are immediately transferable. Some other things have to do very specifically with Mexico's history, which is why I think López Obrador didn't get the attention in the United States that Claudia Sheinbaum is getting. Because López Obrador is really a product of what they call the Mexico Profundo, the deep Mexico, not from the Mexico City kind of, upper middle class kind of whiter set, but from a small town in Tabasco, son of a shopkeeper, speaking in a real Mexican idiom, lover of Mexico, real deep Mexico in that sense. Huh? But one thing that I think anyone can pick up on from López Obrador's trajectory is this absolute insistence on keeping going. This is somebody who ran for governor twice, had everything thrown at him right when that PRD party was just a fledgling party. He led a march, the Exodus for Democracy, walking from Mexico City to the Zocalo in Mexico City, which is like 1,000 miles, something like that.
Wow.
To camp out in the 90s to get those first electoral wins recognized officially. This is somebody who then, ran for mayor, piloted some of his first programs that we then saw at the national level, ran for president 3 times.
Right.
Because kind of the idea is in the U.S. you run once, and if you lose or if you're cheated,
Yeah,
then
you
you're thrown out. I mean, you give up, or you move on to some corporate board, and it's just a lot easier. Mm-hmm. You have to keep at it. And I mean, really, we're talking about somebody, it's like the Bob Dylan never-ending tour. López Obrador was the never-ending tour. He would visit every municipality in this country multiple times, in a country where sometimes you have to get to the end of the road and walk X hours to get to the municipal center, right? Up in the mountains or whatever else. I mean, Mexico is a very mountainous place. There's some very remote parts of it. And you have to have a ground game, and you have to do grassroots. And that, I think, that is very easily transferable to the U.S., where it's actually a lot easier to travel. So there's no excuse. There's no excuse to not be getting to every town, every single town. The whole idea of a 50-state strategy, but taking it seriously and not just mouthing that, but taking it seriously and having a ground game everywhere. And then just on the other direction, I'd also like to push back on this idea that, because, every time there's a State of the Union here in Mexico, the president has, promotional time to do some videos to lay out what's happening, right? And a lot of those did the rounds in the U.S., and I was very happy to see that. I was really happy to see that. They got a lot of attention. Mexico's building new train lines. They're building out a train network. There's going to be 2 train lines that go to the U.S. border. You can now, in a few years, be able to take the train from Nuevo Laredo right down to Mexico City, and then from there to, the Yucatan where it's. They're doing a lot of things, building hospitals, building schools, everything we saw in the video. And I think there was some mistaken interpretations that this is simply just an abundance agenda. And it's not that. And it's important to highlight that. First of all, because it's applying a U.S. discourse onto Mexico, and that's dangerous because you're simply applying a U.S. paradigm onto a very different culture, which is in a different place, without kind of taking the time. Just, we can't be experts on everywhere, but, digging in a little bit to see what's going on there and see if your kind of overlapping idea applies or not. And the second thing is the building out of the infrastructure is just a part of it. Right. From what I understand, the abundance agenda is actually kind of based on kind of techie stuff and deregulation stuff and all this stuff, privatization.
It isn't about government infrastructure.
It isn't about that. And this is right. And these are mostly public projects here that you're seeing there. These are public projects built out with, the federal government. So it's not an abundance discourse. There's infrastructure being built, yes, but that's accompanied by the social programs and, the science programs and, R&D and the rising wages and, trade union reform and outsourcing reform and a whole other raft of things. And I wish people just, before you tweet, just, stop and look a little bit and then tweet and then tweet. But before, instead of trying to have the hot take on somewhere else, that maybe just look into it a little bit.
Right.
That's all I have to say about that.
No, that's, like I said, that's good. That's how I ended up in this mess. Is I had a hot take and man, and I just I'm so, it really is. Honestly, Mexico has personally been a source of hope for me, as you were just alluding to. Not because I think we can just copy and paste everything that you guys are doing. And I've been accused of that a couple times, which is just weird. I'm like, where did I say that we should just cut? But, when I look at things like, I would love the ability to recall a Supreme Court justice, for instance.
Mhm.
Why don't we start there? Why don't we just start with the ability to be like, that is clearly wrong, and we would just like you to come back now. Or, and there's actually a ton of court reform ideas by brilliant people, and I just don't understand why we act like none of it is possible. But yeah, without thinking that we can do copy paste and control Z and that sort of thing. Again, as I alluded to at the beginning, what I am loving to see is that it's the people who are advancing this agenda. It is not some, a inner circle of human beings with a special interest and billions of dollars throwing it at think tanks or whatever to get the results that they want, and to elect the officials that, will continue to let them do their thing. It truly is, you have people coming out en masse for your last presidential election participation was it 65%?
Around there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can't we struggle to get our people out for a presidential election, let alone an off year. We have midterms coming up next year. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in light of everything. But it's clear that the people feel seen by their government, and then they reciprocate by participating in their government. And you're alluding to earlier that it's not just Sheinbaum's power; it's Sheinbaum's power with the people behind her that make it kind of a formidable force. And that is how I believe a republic should be. And just seeing that from, again, this side of the border, watching this play out in real time, and especially watching it play out as a foil against what we're living through right now, I'm just like, I'm like, okay, as much as I really wish I was not in this timeline, because there are days where I'm like, I would like to be literally anywhere else. I also, again, I love my country, even with my and my family's mixed history with it. I am, full disclosure, I'm half Japanese, and so my relationship with the United States is interesting, because there's a lot of history there, and I just love the idea that the republic could actually deliver on being for the people, we the people. As I tell people all the time, I'm like, our Constitution literally starts with "we the people." I don't understand. We got lost somewhere. Where it doesn't say we the corporations, it doesn't say we the super PACs, it doesn't say, whatever, but we're certainly operating like it. And yet it could be better. So I love, first of all the information and data you guys have brought, because you brought me all sorts of numbers, which I crave. I love. If you watch any of my stuff, you'll know it's like I literally will post almost nothing without a chart. But I also love the anecdotal qualitative information as well, which I think is just as important. And that, behind the 13.4 million people lifted out of poverty is that huge gathering in the Zocalo to support Claudia Sheinbaum when she was first facing down the tariffs. I love that behind, the infrastructure projects that we're seeing is people living their best life because they get to, attend these concerts and travel across the country. You have a massive country, actually, so it is like important to be able to travel across it. And I just, yeah, I'm a huge fan. And I hope that we can take this spirit of what's happening, which is that it truly is like the people are taking control of their own fate, sovereignty. And you know, can't we just do that? And I have hope. I do. Some days it's
Can I
small.
tell you the slogan that we use over at Channel 11?
Yeah.
It's that we're not making television for the people, we're the people making television. And it's something I think in a way is like kind of a microcosm. How is it that two guys like us with our views are now on national television? And it shows. It's an example of, the people participating and contributing how they can in spaces that weren't available to us before.
Right. Amazing. All
And
right.
just,
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
I would just say very quickly, just to close out, keep talking about Mexico, because we've talked about a lot of the good things, but the threat from some of the more deranged people in the Trump administration is a real one.
Yes.
I don't think they're going to bomb Mexico tomorrow, but there are people who want to do that.
Yeah.
And people in the U.S. have an enormous power to speak out against that. Just by talking about the good stuff that's going on here, that can, we saw that they wanted to bomb Iran a lot more than they did, and they had to stop.
Right.
And we don't want anything like that to happen down here. And the great way to do that is just to keep talking about what's happening down here.
Yeah, and I definitely plan to, because that is one of, now that I have this accidental platform. It's a crazy long story how that happened, but now that I have it, one of the things that I want to use it for is combating the dangerous propaganda. There's plenty of propaganda, and some of it's pretty like whatever. There's plenty of headlines I have to just kind of let go by because he's doing something wild today. But when it comes to I have a pretty hard, fast, bright line on human rights and national sovereignties and that sort of thing. I'm very clear about it in my discourse with others. And that's usually where I start to like throw temper tantrum-y sort of things in a data-driven way, but still, and I do plan to talk about, I talk a lot about Palestine, Israel, and certainly we'll continue to talk about Mexico. Start talking about Canada too, but Mexico, as you pointed out, has there's, unfortunately, because of the immigration agenda that is being pushed here, is and how Americans tend to like use Mexico as like, kind of a weird stereotypical like block, as like that's the problem right there, which is just, anyway, that's a whole other topic. It is dangerous what is happening right now. The rhetoric, the billions that were just dumped onto ICE through the big beautiful bill. That was one of the scariest parts for me. When I was leading a bunch of campaigning against it, I was just like, this is absurd. Like, we can't, we're funding a police state. So definitely keep doing it. But I am so grateful you guys have gifted your time today, a lot of your time, which is extremely valuable, because I want to make sure that any discourse that I'm pushing forward is of these same people that we were just talking about, and that it's accurate and not being filtered through various corporate media interests and whatnot before it finally gets to the ears of the U.S. And those in my audience who hear it direct like that, and who hear me quote things from Inegi and whatnot, is are very receptive. Like, I know there are people who are like, I never knew this about what's going on in Mexico. This is super cool. So yeah, there's more to come. We'll keep going. So anyway, awesome.
Okay. Thanks so much, Kate, for the space.
Of course, absolutely. And you guys have a great rest of your day, and everyone else, take care, and we'll talk more soon.
Bye.
Bye.